Welcome to the Book of Kings. I say the Book of Kings instead of 1st and 2nd Kings because when it was written, it was not written as two separate books, but one longer book. Then later on, for one reason or another, it was divided into two books. The structure of Kings is actually quite simple. The reason we sometimes find it hard to remember is because there are so many similar sounding names, and there's a lot of kings that seem to do the same kind of things. So let's look at the basic structure. Kings starts by continuing on from the book of Samuel. David is an old man and establishes Solomon as king. Solomon is known for his wisdom, but the main thing that is recorded about him in Kings is his building. He develops Israel, he builds up Jerusalem, and particularly he builds up the temple. Solomon is the last king of a united Israel. His foolish son, Rehoboam, loses power over the northern tribes, who become Israel, but keeps power over the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. Jeroboam becomes the first king of the new Israel, but is sinful, and in order to stop the people going to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem, he makes 2 gold calves for the people to worship instead. Then follow 2 chapters that are characterized by violence and assassinations. Jeroboam's son is killed by Baasha, who becomes king. Elah is killed by Zimri, Zimri by Omri, and Israel is in civil war. Finally, Omri overcomes Tibni to begin the first dynasty in Israel, and his famous son Ahab is the focus of the final section of 1 Kings. Now Ahab has an equally famous wife, Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon. She makes the worship of Baal the religion of Israel, and kills those loyal to Yahweh. In this darkness, God raises up the prophet Elijah. People say that this section is about Elijah versus Ahab, but I think that the situation is more complex than that. Elijah wants to save Ahab. His enemy is Jezebel and Baal. In this final section, God tells Ahab how he's going to die, and that his house will be destroyed. Now we move on to 2 Kings. Ahab is dead, but it's not until the reign of his grandson, Joram, that the prophecy finally gets fulfilled. This period is the time of Elisha, Elijah's disciple. Jehu rises up, destroys the house of Ahab, kills Jezebel, and destroys Baal and his worshippers from Israel. Jehu begins the 2nd dynasty in Israel, but instead of being loyal to Yahweh, he follows in the sins of Jeroboam. Again, God promises to cut off his dynasty in the 4th generation. And this is followed by another period of violence and assassinations. Finally, Israel is conquered by Assyria and taken away in chapter 17. From chapter 18 to the end, the focus is on Judah again, who become increasingly wicked. The Assyrians begin to take parts of the southern kingdom. Then Egypt attacks, and finally Babylon comes and destroys Jerusalem and the temple. So if we look at the overall structure, it's quite easy to remember, and you probably know most of the people and events that I just mentioned already. The first part and the last parts are similar, the cycles of violence are similar, and Ahab and Jehu's dynasties are easy to remember. The focus moves from Judah and Jerusalem to Israel, and then back to Judah and Jerusalem. The main themes of Kings follow on from the first half of the Old Testament, namely, how does God fulfill his promises or covenants in Israel's history? And what does this tell us about these covenants? So the 3 main themes of Kings can be summarized as Israel and the covenant with Abraham, Israel and the covenant with Moses, Israel and the covenant with David. Because Abraham's covenant is a little more complex, we'll save that to the end. The covenant with Moses, however, is incredibly clear. By the end of the book of Samuel, we can see in the life of David, God is keeping his promise to bless those who keep Moses' covenant. So the question is, will the people continue to keep the covenant after David or not? The book of Kings starts well, with Solomon building the temple, which is like a permanent tabernacle. Here we see many of the blessings of the covenant. However, by the end of the first section, Solomon is sinning against God, just as described in the law, and he looks more like Pharaoh than David. The prophets and priests continually try to turn the hearts of the people back to the God of their fathers and re-establish the covenant, but every time the people rebel. Jeroboam makes 2 gold calves like Aaron. There is violence and lawlessness, and Ahab introduces Baal, like we see in the book of Numbers. Jericho is rebuilt, and by the end of the book, Manasseh sacrifices his son. Israel doesn't just break the covenant, they become even worse than the Canaanites that they replaced. So as God promised in his covenant, the people are oppressed, the temple is destroyed, and God sends Israel back to where they came from. Not Egypt, but Mesopotamia, now known as Assyria and Babylon, the homeland of Abraham. Now before we look at the other themes, it would help us to look a little more carefully at some of the other details here in the Book of Kings. Let's first look at Israel, the northern kingdom. And to make the timeline a little more complete, let's separate out the sections about the founding of Israel and its destruction. Interestingly, there are 20 kings of Israel recorded here, and I like to organise them in 4 groups of 5. The reason I do this is because memorising the names of the kings in order will really help to build a time frame for the Book of Kings and understand the events better. Next, I want to look at the kings of Judah, and interestingly there are also 20. Those of you who are good at maths should have noticed that there are 40 kings, which is a biblical number. In the days of Noah it rained 40 days and 40 nights. Israel were in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus fasted 40 days. David ruled 40 years. 40 symbolizes a long period of time, enough time. The point is, history has continued long enough for you to see the pattern. If things went on for 80 kings, the pattern would remain the same. So what is the pattern? The pattern is the same as we have seen in Judges and Samuel. When things went bad, the people cried out to God and God saved them. As soon as the people were saved and life was comfortable, they forgot God and returned to their sins. Then their sin led to suffering, and in their suffering they cried out to God again. This is why a lot of the Book of Kings feels repetitive. It's because people are repetitive. We don't learn from our mistakes. We continually return to our sins like a dog to its own vomit. Now the kings of Judah are more difficult to remember, but I've started each of these sections with the key people you need to remember. So there's Solomon, Rehoboam, Jehoshaphat, Jehoash, Hezekiah, Josiah. Now the careful viewer might have noticed that there are 21 names here, not 20. That's because there's a queen, and she's not of the line of Judah. Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab, and when her son, Ahaziah, died, she killed everyone in the house of David and ruled for 6 years. In that time she made Baal the principal god in Judah, just as Ahab her father had done in Israel. But how did this happen? If we look more closely at the chapters involving Ahab and Jehu, we will notice that actually it's not all about Israel. There is quite a lot about Judah too. From 1 Kings 22 to 2 Kings 3, Jehoshaphat is friendly with the house of Ahab and goes to fight for him. It's at this time that he makes the union between the two countries stronger by taking Ahab's daughter Athaliah to marry his son Jehoram. However, rather than changing Israel, it is Judah that is changed. Evil Israel does not take Judah's God, but Judah takes Israel's gods. Similarly, 2 Kings chapters 1 to 13 are not only focused on Israel. There is a section about Jehoash, one of the sons of Ahaziah, who was hidden from Athaliah when he was a baby. With the help of the priest Jehoiada, Jehoash becomes king, kills Athaliah, and destroys Baal from Judah just as Jehu had done in Israel. Another thing you might have noticed if you read Kings carefully is that Zedekiah is not the last king mentioned. Jehoiakim is. Jehoiakim is freed by the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil-Merodach, and eats with the king at his table. But why is this important? Because it highlights the second theme in the Book of Kings, the covenant to David, here summarized by Solomon. Now therefore, O Lord, God of Israel, keep for your servant David my father what you have promised him, saying, You shall not lack a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me, as you have walked before me. This promised son is so important that we give him a special name, which in the Old Testament is Messiah, and in the New Testament, Christ. So it's important to see that none of David's sons in the Book of Kings are faithful like David. They all sin. But the line is never cut. The sons of David continue. And when we see Jehoiakim at the end of the Book of Kings, we start to think, well, maybe he could have a son. Maybe he will be that promised king that will restore the people to God, bring them back to Israel and establish the kingdom. Actually, that's kind of right. Hundreds of years later, there's a child born in Judah who is in the line of David and Jehoiakim, called Jesus. He is that promised king, that promised Christ. And if we look in his genealogy, we can see Jehoiakim. Here he's called Jeconiah. Now that we have looked at the kings, let's spend some time thinking about the prophets, especially Elijah and Elisha. They are both famous for their miracles, and here we see Elijah do 7 miracles. Now 7 is another biblical number, which symbolizes perfect and complete. Interestingly, we see Elisha do 14 miracles, which is 7 times 2. This is because when Elijah is taken to heaven, Elisha asks Elijah for a double portion of your spirit. In many ways, Elijah is easier to understand than Elisha. His life is spent trying to bring Israel back to Yahweh. He is very dynamic, he confronts kings, but then runs away to Mount Sinai. Elisha, on the other hand, is different. He seems more passive, more reclusive. There is actually a strange section at the beginning of the book of 2 Kings that often gets missed out of overviews. It's about Elisha and the Syrians. Syria, the kingdom north of Israel, is the main enemy for most of the book of Kings. Initially, it's Egypt, then Syria. After Syria, it's Assyria in the east, and later Babylon, who replace Assyria as the great empire. These events raise the question of the relationship between the Gentiles and God, and brings us to the final theme of Kings, the covenant with Abraham. At the beginning of the book of Kings, we see Solomon and Israel fulfill many of the things promised to Abraham. They occupy the land, they are at peace, they have the temple, and are prosperous. Within a generation, it's all in question. By the end of the book, there is no people, no land, and no temple. Can Israel, by being unfaithful to God, cause him to break his covenant with Abraham? This is a big question for both Elijah and Elisha. So when Elijah goes back to Sinai, where God made a covenant with Moses, he gets the first part of the answer. Not all Israel are God's people. Not all of those who are descendants of Abraham receive the covenant. There is a people within Israel, a remnant, that are the true people of God. But this isn't the full answer, as Jesus notes in Luke 4:26-27. The Gentiles show themselves to be faithful and are favoured by God, when Israel is unfaithful and under the judgment of God. So from Kings we can see that if you're born into Israel, but behave like a Gentile, you will be punished like a Gentile. However, if you're a Gentile and trust in the God of Israel, you will be blessed like an Israelite. We are not God's people because of how we are born or who our parents are. We are God's people because we are faithful to Him. Now one last thought. This line is in the wrong place. It should actually be further left. The dividing line between the first half and the second half actually happens in 2 Kings chapter 2. The pivot or key point is Elijah going up to heaven. But why is that so important? Why not defeating the prophets of Baal or the armies of the Assyrians? It's because it reminds us who the real king of the Book of Kings is. From the beginning to the end, there has been one king reigning, one king with true power over all of the events, one King of Kings. And when we see Elijah go to be with the great king, it reminds us that often we fix our eyes on the wrong things. We focus on earthly kings when we should have our eyes fixed on the heavenly King.